In May of 1945, the surrender of Nazi Germany marked the end of World War II in Europe. While the world celebrated the collapse of the Third Reich, thousands of German soldiers faced an uncertain fate under the custody of the Allied forces. But for the members of the feared SS, the outcome was especially grim. Captured by the Soviets, these men, considered responsible for the worst atrocities of the Nazi regime, became the target of relentless justice. The captured soldiers were sent to the gulags, forced labor camps where hunger, cold, and exhausting workdays defined their daily lives. Others faced summary trials that ended in immediate executions. Was this an act of justice or revenge? Amid these stories of suffering and death, some managed to survive and return home, but with physical and emotional scars that would mark their lives forever. What can these victims tell us? Were they as cruel as the Germans? What kinds of punishments do they have for their prisoners? The decline of the Reich, the surrender of the SAS. In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled under the advance of the Allied forces, thousands of German soldiers, including members of the feared SS, faced a harsh reality. Berlin, the epicenter of the Nazi regime, was in ruins, surrounded by the Red Army. Surrender was inevitable, but for the SS men, the future promised to be darker than for any other German unit. The SS, the military and political organization most loyal to Adolf Hitler, had played a central role in the atrocities of the Nazi regime. From the implementation of the final solution to the brutal repression in the occupied territories, their reputation was synonymous with terror. With the collapse of the Reich, regular Wehrmacht soldiers had some hope of being treated according to the laws of war, but the SS members knew that their actions made them targets of relentless justice. In the final days of the war, Soviet forces captured tens of thousands of German prisoners on the Eastern Front. Among them, a significant number belonged to the SS, identified by the tattoos they wore on their skin, a marker that betrayed their affiliation. Declassified Soviet documents from 1994 show that the captured soldiers were divided into two main groups, those considered regular soldiers and those identified as SS members, who faced a particularly harsh fate. The testimonies of captured soldiers reveal the severity of those first days. Heinrich S., an SS member captured on the outskirts of Berlin, described the moment of his surrender. "We knew there was no way to escape. We took off our insignia, burned our documents, but the Soviets checked every detail. When they saw my tattoo, everything changed. We were no longer soldiers. We were criminals." The mass surrender of the SS occurred in a climate of chaos and despair. Many tried to hide their identity or blend in with the Wehrmacht soldiers, but Soviet intelligence, aided by defectors and local collaborators, had detailed lists of officers and prominent members. A report from the NKVD, dated May of 1945, details how the interrogations focused on identifying SS leaders and gathering information about their activities during the war. In some cases, surrendering was not enough to guarantee survival. Soviet troops, upon discovering a prisoner's affiliation with the SS, carried out summary executions on the spot. These acts, although not officially authorized, were tolerated in a context of retaliation for the atrocities committed by the Nazis in Soviet territory. In a letter found in Moscow's archives, a Soviet officer justified these actions. "How can we forgive those who burned our villages, murdered our families, and destroyed our land? They did not deserve a trial. They deserved the same death they gave to ours." However, most of the captured soldiers were sent to transit camps, where a more detailed selection process began. There, the prisoners were exhaustively interrogated. Their military records, political backgrounds, and in many cases their bodies were examined for tattoos linking them to the SS. For those identified, the fate was clear: forced labor, trials, or, in extreme cases, immediate executions. An interesting aspect of this process was the use of local witnesses to identify SS members. In recently liberated cities, residents who had directly suffered under Nazi occupation were called upon to point out the perpetrators. Archives found in Poland document how women and children recognized SS members who had overseen massacres or looting in their communities. These identifications often sealed the fate of the accused. While the captured Wehrmacht soldiers were sent to prisoner of war camps under difficult conditions, but in line with international conventions, the SS members faced much harsher treatment. In some transit camps, they were denied food for days or subjected to exhausting labor even before being sent to the gulags. Photographs taken by Soviet soldiers show German prisoners, many of them SS members, chained and visibly emaciated, awaiting their fate. The fate of these men did not only depend on their rank or affiliation, but also on decisions made on the ground. In some cases, Soviet officers allowed the prisoners to be executed by the same communities that had suffered under their occupation. In others, they were brought to trial, although these processes rarely met standards of impartial justice. The surrender of the SS members at the end of the war marked the beginning of a period of suffering that many did not survive. For the Soviets, these captures were not only an opportunity for justice, but also a tool to send a clear message to the rest of the world. The crimes committed under the Nazi regime would not go unpunished. Punishment and redemption, the ideology behind the treatment of prisoners. With the collapse of the Third Reich in 1945, the Soviets encountered an overwhelming number of German prisoners, including thousands of SS members. For the communist regime, these captures provided a unique opportunity not only to punish those they considered guilty of the worst crimes of the war, but also to reinforce their ideological narrative. The Soviet Union had suffered devastating losses at the hands of the Nazis, with more than 26 million dead, millions of displaced civilians, and a country in ruins. This collective trauma fueled a mix of revenge and pragmatism in the treatment of prisoners. Documents from the NKVD, declassified in 1993, show that official orders demanded that SS members be treated as priority enemies, subjected to rigorous interrogations, and separated from regular soldiers. The Soviet approach to these prisoners was deeply rooted in their ideology. The SS were not only seen as direct perpetrators of Nazi atrocities, but also as representatives of a fascist ideology diametrically opposed to communism. For Soviet leaders, punishing these men was not only a matter of justice, but a demonstration of the triumph of socialism over Nazism. In a speech in 1946, Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD, declared, "Each captured SS member is a reminder of the brutality of fascism and a symbol of our ideological victory." Propaganda played a crucial role in this narrative. Soviet films, posters, and newspapers depicted the SS as the embodiment of evil, responsible for massacres, deportations, and the destruction of entire villages. This approach not only sought to justify the harsh treatment of prisoners, but also to reinforce the image of the Soviet Union as the great liberator of Europe. An article published in the newspaper Pravda in 1945 stated, "The men of the SS do not deserve compassion. Their punishment is a lesson for all those who dare to challenge the principles of equality and justice." In the prisoner camps and gulags where SS members were sent, this ideology manifested in practices designed both to punish and to re-educate. Some prisoners were forced to attend propaganda sessions where they were exposed to communist ideals and shown films about Nazi atrocities. Soviet archives found in 2002 revealed that these sessions were supervised by political officers who evaluated the prisoners' responses and classified those who showed signs of remorse or willingness to cooperate. However, physical punishment and forced labor were the predominant methods of dealing with these men. The gulags, located in remote regions with extreme climatic conditions, became their main destination. There, prisoners were forced to work on road construction, mines, and factories under exhausting hours with barely any resources. A NKVD report from 1947 documents the death of more than 15,000 German prisoners in a single year due to illness, accidents, and malnutrition. Testimonies from survivors offer a heartbreaking view of this experience. Wilhelm K., a former SS member captured in Königsberg, recounted his days in a gulag near Siberia. The cold was unbearable, food was scarce, and the work never ended. If you collapsed from exhaustion, the guards would beat you or simply let you die. The difference between communist ideals and the reality of prisoner treatment was evident. While Soviet propaganda proclaimed justice, the methods employed often crossed the line into revenge. In some cases, Local officers organized summary trials, condemning prisoners to death based solely on testimonies from civilians or their backgrounds as SS members. An archive found in the Moscow records describes one of these trials in Belarus in 1945, where 30 SS members were publicly executed in front of a crowd of villagers who had suffered under Nazi occupation. A local witness recalled, "There was no mercy in those trials. For us, they were monsters. We wanted to see them pay for what they had done to us." Although revenge was an evident factor, the Soviet approach also had a practical component. With a country devastated by war, German prisoners, including SS members, were seen as a valuable source of labor. In addition to the gulags, many were sent to reconstruction projects in destroyed cities, where they worked under strict supervision. A report from 1948 details how German prisoners were used to repair key infrastructures in Stalingrad and Kiev, often in conditions bordering on slavery. Re-education, although less frequent, also played a role in the treatment of prisoners. Some SS members, especially the younger ones, were selected for programs designed to instill communist values in them. In exchange for showing loyalty to the Soviet regime, they were offered less severe conditions and even the opportunity to reintegrate into society as collaborators. However, this type of treatment was the exception rather than the rule, and most prisoners spent their years in captivity under a regime of brutality and exploitation. Soviet ideology dictated much of the treatment of SS members captured in 1945. For the authorities, these men were not just prisoners of war, but symbols of an ideological struggle that transcended the war itself. However, the thin line between justice and revenge was constantly blurred, leaving behind a legacy of stories of suffering that reflect both the desire for punishment and the contradictions inherent in a regime that sought justice while resorting to equally brutal methods. Was it justice or justified revenge? Life in the gulags, forced labor and survival. After Germany's surrender in 1945, the captured members of the SS were sent in large numbers to Soviet gulags, a system of forced labor camps that stretched across vast regions of the Soviet Union. For these prisoners, the experience in the gulags became an extreme test of physical and psychological endurance. They faced brutal conditions designed not only to punish, but also to exploit their labor in the reconstruction of a country devastated by war. The arrival at the gulags was just the beginning of their ordeal. Prisoners were transported in freight trains, often for weeks, in overcrowded cars with little ventilation. Once in the camps, they were subjected to a strict registration process, where their personal details were cataloged, and in the case of SS members, they were marked as maximum security prisoners. Declassified Soviet archives from 2002 detail how tattoos and previously compiled lists were used to identify these men, who were separated from other prisoners and sent to high-security camps in remote regions such as Siberia and the Arctic. Life conditions in the gulags were inhuman. The barracks, often built from uninsulated wood, offered little protection against the extreme winters, where temperatures dropped below 40 degrees Celsius. Prisoners slept on wooden planks, sharing cramped spaces with dozens of men, and struggled to stay warm with tattered blankets and insufficient clothing. In these conditions, diseases such as tuberculosis, dysentery, and typhus spread quickly, claiming thousands of lives. Forced labor was the central focus of life in the gulags. Prisoners were forced to carry out exhausting tasks, from cutting wood in dense forests to digging mines or constructing infrastructure in the most inhospitable areas of the country. The workdays began before dawn and stretched until dusk, with minimal breaks and under the constant supervision of armed guards. A report from the NKVD in 1947 describes how SS members were assigned to the hardest and most dangerous jobs as part of their punishment. In one of the camps in Vorkuta, prisoners were ordered to build a railway line in extreme cold, a project that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of them. A striking testimony from a German survivor, identified as Hans L., captured in eastern Prussia and sent to a gulag in Kolyma, recounts, "We worked until our bodies could take no more. Hunger was constant, and the cold penetrated our bones. Every day we saw our comrades die, and we knew we might be next." The food was scarce and mainly consisted of rations of black bread, watery soup, and occasionally dried fish. These portions barely met the caloric needs of men who worked for 14 or more hours a day. A document found in Moscow's archives indicates that, in some camps, rations were further reduced as a collective punishment for escape attempts or acts of insubordination. Severe malnutrition was common, and many prisoners suffered from kwashiorkor, a condition caused by a lack of protein, which resulted in swelling and extreme weakness. The Gulag system not only physically punished prisoners, but also sought to break their spirit. Guards maintained a constant atmosphere of terror, using beatings, isolation, and humiliation as tools of control. Declassified files include interrogation reports where prisoners were forced to confess non-existent crimes or betray others in an attempt to divide them and sow distrust. One of these reports describes how a group of German prisoners was accused of sabotage and publicly executed to serve as an example. However, despite the extreme conditions, some prisoners found ways to resist. In several gulags, German prisoners, including SS members, formed small clandestine groups to support one another. They shared food, clothing, and advice on how to survive in the hostile environment. These support networks became a vital source of hope for many, although they were not without risks. A Soviet guard, cited in a report from 1949, wrote, "These men, even in the worst conditions, found ways to stay united. It was frustrating to see that they didn't give up easily." In some cases, prisoners resorted to riskier strategies to improve their conditions. Some tried to negotiate with the guards by offering their technical skills or knowledge as bargaining chips. Others, less fortunate, attempted to escape, although most of these attempts ended in immediate capture and execution. Archives from a camp in Siberia document at least 50 escape attempts between 1946 and 1950, all of which failed. In addition to the physical and emotional challenges, prisoners also faced cultural and linguistic isolation. Many did not speak Russian and depended on other prisoners to translate orders and communicate with the guards. This isolation heightened their sense of vulnerability and despair. However, some attempted to learn the language as a way to integrate or, in rare occasions, gain the sympathy of their captors. Over time, the harsh conditions of the gulags and the high mortality rate began to decline due to political changes after Stalin's death in 1953. Although many German prisoners did not survive, those who did carried the weight of their experience for the rest of their lives. Their testimony became a key piece in understanding the horror of the gulags and the human cost of Soviet policy toward prisoners of war. The Gulag system reflected the Soviet approach to justice and punishment, and also showed how prisoners, even in the most extreme conditions, could find ways to adapt and resist. Cold-blooded justice, the trials and executions of the SS. The fall of the Third Reich in 1945 brought with it a thirst for justice, especially in the territories devastated by the Nazi occupation. For the captured SS soldiers, this justice often materialized in the form of summary trials and immediate executions. The Soviets, who had suffered immensely under the German occupation, sought not only to punish those responsible for the war crimes, but also to send a clear message to the world about the consequences of the atrocities committed. For them, the Germans were seen as more than enemies. They were beyond that, they were seen as true criminals. After capture, the SS members were separated from other prisoners and subjected to intensive interrogations by the NKVD. Declassified Soviet documents from 1997 revealed that these interrogations not only sought to gather information about Nazi operations, but also to identify those responsible for specific crimes in the occupied territories. SS officers were particularly sought after, and their names appeared on lists compiled from witness testimonies and confiscated files. In many cases, the trials did not meet international standards of justice. These proceedings, carried out in recently liberated villages and cities, were quick and brutal. A report from the NKVD from 1945 details how prisoners were presented before improvised tribunals, often in public squares or government buildings damaged by the war. The witnesses, many of them civilians who had suffered under the occupation, provided heartbreaking accounts of the crimes committed by the accused. A survivor from Belarus recounted how they identified the SS officer who oversaw the execution of their family. "I looked him in the eyes and said his name. He didn't try to deny it. He knew there was no escape." The sentences were almost always the same: the death penalty. The executions, often carried out the same day, were conducted publicly as a way to provide the affected communities with a sense of immediate justice. Files found in Poland document a mass execution in the city of Minsk, where more than 50 SS members were shot in front of a crowd of hundreds of people. A local witness described the scene as a mixture of relief and horror. "We wanted to see them pay, but it was also difficult to see so much death, even if they were our enemies." Although many of these trials were summary, some more complex cases were referred to military courts. In these proceedings, prisoners were tried for their specific crimes, from mass executions to overseeing concentration camps. One of the best-known cases was that of an SS commander captured near Königsberg, accused of ordering the massacre of more than 3,000 civilians in Ukraine. During his trial, confiscated documents and witness testimonies were presented that detailed his actions. The sentence, as expected, was the death penalty. Interestingly, not all captured SS members faced the same fate. Some, especially those who cooperated with the Soviets or provided valuable information, avoided execution. NKVD files mention cases of SS officers who provided details about Nazi troop movements, supply hideouts, and even information about secret projects in exchange for clemency. However, this cooperation did not always guarantee their safety, as many of them were later sent to the gulags, where they faced equally brutal conditions. In addition to formal trials, the Soviets employed extrajudicial methods to deal with SS members. On several occasions, prisoners were executed en masse without trial, especially in regions where Nazi atrocities had left a deep mark. A file found in Ukraine details how a group of 30 SS prisoners was shot in retaliation for the destruction of a nearby village during the occupation. These acts, though not official, were tolerated by local authorities as a way to satisfy the justice demands of the population. The use of torture was also a recurrent component during the interrogations. Although the Soviets justified these practices as necessary to obtain confessions, the accounts of the prisoners reveal a grim picture. A report from 1946 describes how methods such as beatings, sleep deprivation, and exposure to extreme cold were used to break the prisoners. A former SS member captured in East Prussia recounted years later how he was subjected to constant interrogations under torture. "They didn't know exactly what I had done, but they wanted me to confess to something. After days without food or rest, I signed what they asked." Propaganda also played an important role in these trials and executions. The Soviets meticulously documented the proceedings and sentences using photographs and films to show the world how justice was being served. These images, published in newspapers and shown in cinemas, depicted the accused chained, facing witnesses, and finally being executed. This approach not only reinforced the narrative of Soviet victory, but also served as a warning to any potential enemy. Despite the severity of the treatment toward SS members, the trials and executions carried out by the Soviets have been the subject of historical debate. While many of these men were responsible for atrocious war crimes, the conditions under which the trials and summary executions were carried out raise questions about the limits of justice in times of war. The treatment of SS prisoners under Soviet custody became a symbol of post-war brutality. For many, these men represented the worst of the Nazi regime, and their fate reflected both the desire for justice and the depth of the pain left by the war. In the trials and executions of the SS, the world witnessed a chapter where justice and revenge intertwined inseparably, leaving an indelible mark on the history of World War II. Between death and oblivion, the high mortality rate in the camps, the capture of thousands of German prisoners, including members of the SS, posed a logistical challenge for the Soviet Union in the years following the Second World War. These men were sent to the gulags, where they faced conditions that were fatal for many of them. The mortality rate in Soviet camps reached alarming figures, driven by hunger, disease, grueling labor, and the brutal treatment they received. This chapter addresses the reasons behind these deaths and the experiences of the prisoners who managed to survive. The gulags, located in remote and often inhospitable regions, were designed both to punish and to exploit the labor of the prisoners. For the members of the SS, these conditions were even more extreme, as they were assigned particularly dangerous tasks and were denied the minimal concessions that other prisoners could receive. Documents from the NKVD in 1946 show that the members of the SS were considered priority in terms of surveillance and punishment, as they were seen as the ideological core of the defeated enemy. Hunger was one of the main factors behind the high mortality rate in the camps. Food rations were minimal and did not meet the caloric requirements necessary for the forced labor days. The prisoners survived on black bread, watery cabbage soup, and occasionally dried fish. An intercepted letter from a German prisoner in Vorkuta described the despair they felt. "The food is not enough even for a child. We weaken each day, and some simply do not get out of their beds. We die of hunger slowly and quietly." Diseases were another major enemy. Tuberculosis, typhus, and dysentery spread rapidly in the overcrowded and poorly ventilated barracks. Prisoners who fell ill rarely received proper medical attention, and many were left to their fate. Declassified files in Moscow reveal that, in some camps, mortality rates from disease exceeded 30% in a single year. A report from a camp in Siberia details how the sick prisoners were moved to separate barracks, known as waiting zones, where they were simply left to die. Forced labor also contributed significantly to the deaths. The prisoners were forced to perform exhausting tasks in extreme weather conditions, from building roads and railways to extracting coal and timber. In winter, temperatures fell below 40 degrees below zero, while in summer, insects and humidity made the conditions equally unbearable. In the Kolyma Gulag archives, there are records of prisoners who died from exhaustion while collapsing in the mines. Their bodies recovered only days later. Escape attempts, though rare due to the distances and inhospitable conditions, also contributed to mortality. Prisoners who were captured after an escape attempt faced immediate executions or extreme punishments. A Soviet guard from a camp in Siberia recalled how escape attempts were punished as a way to deter others. Those who tried to escape rarely made it more than a few kilometers. We found them frozen, starving, or killed by wild animals. For the others, they served as a warning that escaping was impossible. The combination of these factors created an environment where life was fleeting and death constant. In some camps, corpses piled up in mass graves, covered with lime to prevent the spread of disease. A testimony from a German survivor captured in Königsberg recounts the experience of working on the removal of bodies. Each day, we carried the dead in wheelbarrows to a pit in the forest. We stopped counting after the first month. It was as if death had become part of the routine. However, not all prisoners perished. Some managed to survive thanks to support networks among the internees. These networks, though small and clandestine, allowed prisoners to share food, clothing, and advice on how to endure forced labor. An NKVD file mentions that these networks were especially common among the German prisoners, who would band together in groups to help each other, although often at the risk of being discovered and punished. Soviet propaganda minimized the high mortality rate in the gulags, presenting the camps as places of re-education and justice for the enemies of the people. However, internal documents show a very different reality. In a report from 1947, an NKVD officer admitted that mortality in some camps exceeds acceptable levels, but current conditions do not allow for improvements. This statement reflects the authorities' indifference to the suffering of the prisoners, who were considered expendable in the grand scheme of the Soviet Union's reconstruction. Although conditions in the gulags began to improve slightly after Stalin's death in 1953, by then, many prisoners had already succumbed to the harsh conditions. Those few who survived carried physical and emotional scars that would last their whole lives. Their testimony not only sheds light on the brutality of the camps, but also on the human capacity to endure in the most extreme circumstances. The high mortality rate in the Soviet gulags was a reflection of the regime's relentless policies towards prisoners of war, especially those linked to the SS. The power of regret. Prisoners turned into collaborators. In the Soviet gulags, where hunger, forced labor, and diseases defined the daily existence of prisoners, some captives sought desperate alternatives to survive. Among the members of the SS and other German prisoners, a controversial option emerged: collaborating with the Soviet authorities. Although collaboration did not guarantee better conditions, it offered a chance of relief in an environment marked by extreme suffering. From the beginning, The Soviet authorities implemented programs designed to identify prisoners susceptible to being re-educated or used as informants. These programs were primarily aimed at young prisoners and those with lower ranks within the SS, who, according to the Soviets, could be more easily manipulated. Declassified NKVD files from 1999 show that incentives such as better rations, reduced working hours, or less severe conditions were offered to those who agreed to collaborate. In many cases, prisoners were recruited for tasks ranging from gathering information about other inmates to participating in communist propaganda activities. Communist re-education became a key tool for recruitment. In several camps, mandatory educational sessions were organized in which the principles of Marxism-Leninism were taught and fascist ideologies were criticized. Prisoners were forced to attend lectures, read political texts, and engage in debates. A report from 1948 details how some prisoners began to repeat communist rhetoric in their public statements, although this was often simply a survival mechanism. Among the collaborators, there were those who took on a more active role, serving as translators, supervisors, or even mediators between the prisoners and the guards. One notable case was that of Karl W., a former SS officer who, after several months in a gulag in Siberia, offered his services as a translator to the Soviet authorities. Files found in 2004 describe how Karl used his position to negotiate better conditions for certain groups of prisoners in exchange for information on escape attempts and underground networks. Although his collaboration allowed him to avoid forced labor, it also made him a target of distrust and hostility among his fellow inmates. For others, collaboration meant participating in propaganda activities aimed at other prisoners. In a camp in Vorkuta, prisoners who showed willingness to collaborate were filmed denouncing the Nazi regime and praising the principles of communism. These recordings were used not only inside the camps but also abroad as part of the Soviet strategy to project an image of justice and ideological superiority. A file from 1949 describes one of these films, in which a German prisoner stated, "Thanks to the Soviet Union, I have learned to see the mistakes of my past. I now understand that fascism brings nothing but destruction." However, collaboration was not always voluntary. Brutal interrogations and threats of reprisals against fellow barracks mates were common tactics used to force prisoners to cooperate. In an NKVD report, it is described how some prisoners were forced to spy on their fellow inmates under the threat of being sent to punishment barracks or receiving less food. A former guard from a gulag in Kazakhstan recounted how these informants were seen as useful tools, but disposable. "We knew they only collaborated because they had no other option. When they stopped being useful, they returned to the group and the cycle continued." Not all collaborators did so due to direct pressure. Some prisoners, faced with years of captivity in extreme conditions, began to adopt the communist ideologies they were taught. Although these cases were in the minority, documents indicate that some prisoners truly believed in the Soviet narrative and sought to prove their loyalty. A file from 1950 describes how a group of German prisoners formed a committee to promote educational activities within the camp, including organizing Russian language classes and debates on socialist literature. The fate of the collaborators after their release varied. Some returned to East Germany, where they were integrated into society under the supervision of the communist regime. These men often played roles in local administration, using their experience in the gulags as proof of their commitment to the socialist system. However, in West Germany, the collaborators faced a different fate. Once identified, many were rejected by their communities and labeled as traitors. A report from 1956 recounts how a former collaborator was attacked by his neighbors after returning to his hometown in Bavaria. Despite the incentives offered by the Soviets, collaboration also had its risks. Prisoners who collaborated were often viewed with suspicion both by the Soviet authorities and by their fellow captives. In the barracks, collaborators were closely watched and, in some cases, attacked by other prisoners who considered them traitors. A testimony from a German survivor describes how one of these collaborators was beaten to death after being discovered informing the guards about an escape attempt. The phenomenon of collaboration among German prisoners in the gulags reflects the complexity of survival under extreme conditions. Although some did it out of conviction, most were forced to make difficult decisions to protect themselves in a hostile environment. These stories, although less known, offer a unique insight into the power dynamics and resistance within the Gulag system, where even the smallest gestures could make the difference between life and death. Homecoming, the long journey of the survivors. The death of Stalin in 1953 marked a turning point for the German prisoners of war held in Soviet gulags. The policies of the new leadership under Nikita Khrushchev led to the gradual release of the survivors, including members of the SS, who faced a long and arduous journey back home. However, this return was marked by uncertainty, rejection, and stigma. For many, the return was not the end of their suffering, but the beginning of a struggle to reintegrate into a society that had changed profoundly during their absence. The repatriation of the prisoners began gradually. In 1955, after negotiations between West Germany and the Soviet Union, agreements were signed for the release of the last German prisoners of war. These agreements included prisoners who had been convicted of war crimes, although many had already served long sentences in the gulags. A declassified Soviet report from 1989 details how prisoners were transported by train from Siberia and other remote regions to repatriation points in Eastern Europe, where they were handed over to the German authorities. The journey back was not without challenges. The trains, overcrowded and with scarce resources, carried men weakened by years of forced labor, hunger, and disease. A testimony from Heinrich K., a former SS member repatriated in 1956, describes the condition of the men in his carriage. "We were shadows of what we once were. Some died on the way. It wasn't a trip home, it was another challenge in our fight to survive." Upon arrival in Germany, the prisoners faced a reality that was hard to assimilate. In East Germany, governed by a communist regime, the repatriates were received with some caution. Although some were integrated into the workforce and offered roles in local administration, they were closely watched by the authorities, who feared that they could spread ideas contrary to communism. Stasi files reveal that many of these men were subjected to interrogations and constant surveillance, especially those who had served in the SS. In West Germany, the reception was even more complicated. Unlike their Wehrmacht counterparts, former SS members faced deep stigma. Many citizens considered them directly responsible for the crimes of the Third Reich, and their affiliation with the organization made them social outcasts. A report from the Bavarian government in 1958 describes how entire communities rejected repatriates who had been identified as SS members, seeing them as an uncomfortable reminder of the Nazi past. For the survivors, reintegration was a constant struggle. After years in the gulags, many returned with physical and mental health problems that hindered their ability to work. Some, traumatized by their experiences, chose isolation, while others tried to rebuild their lives in silence, hiding their past from their families and communities. A personal file discovered in Hamburg details how one repatriate changed his name and moved to another region to avoid the stigma associated with his past. Despite these challenges, some repatriates managed to find support in underground networks formed by other survivors. These networks provided a space to share experiences, find work, and, in some cases, organize politically. However, these groups also attracted the attention of the authorities, especially in West Germany, where the Allies continued to closely monitor any resurgence of Nazi ideologies. The stories of the survivors offer a heartbreaking glimpse into the complexity of their return. A former SS prisoner, identified as Karl M., wrote in his memoirs, "Coming home didn't mean returning to life. The war had taken everything from us, and the time in the gulags finished destroying what was left. Many of us never found our place in this new world." The release of the prisoners also had an impact on the families who had spent years without news of their loved ones. In some cases, the men returned to find their families shattered or missing. Others discovered that their homes had been occupied by new residents or destroyed during the war. This emotional shock deepened the sense of alienation that many already felt. Although most prisoners were released in the 1950s, some remained under Soviet custody well into the 1960s, especially those accused of serious war crimes. Records indicate that these men were tried in Soviet courts and sentenced to long sentences, while others simply disappeared in the camps without a trace. A report from Amnesty International in 1970 mentions cases of prisoners whose names appeared on official lists years after their supposed release, suggesting that some never returned. The return of the German prisoners marked the end of a dark chapter in World War II history, but also left many wounds open. For the men who survived the gulags, the road home was only the beginning of a new battle, finding a place in a world that viewed them with distrust and was not always willing to forgive. Their stories, filled with suffering, resilience, and struggle, are a testament to the human aftermath of a conflict that left deep scars on all those involved. The fate of the SS prisoners captured by the Soviets in 1945 reveals a complex and heartbreaking chapter of post-war history. These men, identified as the embodiment of the Nazi machinery, faced retribution that fluctuated between justice and revenge. From interrogations and summary trials to the inhumane conditions in the gulags, their experiences reflect the brutality of a world seeking to close wounds while still trapped in the pain of conflict. The Soviet Union used these prisoners not only as a source of forced labor, but also as a propaganda tool to consolidate its ideological narrative. However, the human consequences of this treatment left deep scars, both for those who perished and for those who survived. The stories of hunger, disease, exhausting labor, and isolation illustrate the dimensions of suffering in the camps, while the tales of collaboration and resistance highlight the struggle to preserve humanity in the most adverse circumstances. In the end, the return of the survivors was a transition full of challenges. Rejected by their communities, monitored by the authorities, and marked by the horrors they had lived through, many faced a long road to reintegration. Their stories, largely silenced, are a reminder of the complex dynamics of justice in times of war and the aftermath that persists long after conflicts have ended. This chapter of our world history invites us to reflect on the legacy of these events, reminding us that, even in the search for justice, it is vital not to lose sight of the principles of humanity and ethics that must guide any society.